Hello and welcome to another edition of Across the Line series to highlight China's most important bilateral relationship with the U.S. following the landmark 19th National Congress of the Chinese Communist Party. Are we in a collision course as both Republicans and Democrats seek to reassess China's global ambition, its roadmap of modernization, and the old policy of engagement by Washington? To have a broad perspective about the future of greater uncertainty today, I'm joined by Dr. Su Ge, President of the China Institute of International Studies, and co-hosting the show with Jessica Stone in Washington.
Good evening, and thank you, Yang Rui. It's great to be here with you. And there is one important question that I posed to a number of Washington China hands concerning the 19th Party Congress, and that is this. What is the biggest issue that demands cooperation between Beijing and Washington? Well, of course, China and the United States are the world's two largest economies, and when you think about it, together they've invented, made, and traded many of the world's goods. And among their recent accomplishments, also reaching the Iran nuclear deal and the Paris Climate Accords. But one of their toughest challenges ahead remains preserving peace on the Korean Peninsula and beyond. We asked China watchers here in Washington to identify the issues that will require Beijing's and Washington's cooperation in the coming decades.
How does the U.S. adjust to the rise of China and its new military, economic, and diplomatic influence? We can get at that cooperatively, or we can get at that through competition.
The threat of the North Korean nuclear and missile program comes to mind as one of the very prominent challenges in the Asia-Pacific region that the U.S. and China need to be working more closely together on and trying to confront more urgently, I think.
I would propose that as an agenda item for the U.S. to work out its new relationship with a rising China, that we take subjects that are a little bit less sensitive, not sovereignty, but maybe fish. You know, the feeding the people of China and preventing the depletion of the world's fishing stocks could be a good topic.
I think the biggest issue are the concerns emanating from the uncertainty relating to the both policy level and the political nature. I think on policy level, obviously, as everybody is aware of China, there's a lot of policy up and downs, and then the change, especially related to the financials.
Now as the economies more overlap and we compete more, figuring out the rules of the game so that we can compete constructively is, I think, the biggest challenge economically that we face. It's important both for our domestic economies as well for the world.
I believe U.S. and China will have to collaborate and cooperate in different areas, including Korea, South China Sea, and increasingly probably going to be in the Middle East and Central Asia.
I want to see greater Chinese competition generate a virtuous cycle in its relationship with others and push American companies to be better. But I'm also worried about a vicious cycle being created if Chinese industrial policy isn't healthier, isn't fair, isn't more open.
I think somebody from China mentioned that Pacific is big enough to have both China and U.S. collaborating within, actually.
The Pacific is big, but only small amounts of it are really testing the limits of friendship. When you think about the South China Sea, you think about island building, tense naval patrols. When you think about the East China Sea, you might think about DPRK missile launches and U.S. military exercises. But the United States and China do trade with each other more than any other nations. The question now is, will collaboration between those two countries be able to prevent another Korean war? Jessica Stone, CGTN, Washington.
Welcome to our discussion here in the Beijing studio. Dr. Su, what are areas where U.S. and China stakes might most converge?
Well, U.S. and China are two of the most important countries in the world. So the relationship is also the most important, if one of the most important in the world. Because if these two countries do not cooperate, then that would hurt the general direction of even peace and development in the world. That being said, I think that U.S.-China being two major countries in the world, they have so many areas in which they have contact with each other. If that's the case, then they got to have frictions and problems. For instance, in trade and investment and all economic areas, they have differences. And in political, strategic issues, just now people mentioned the South China Sea, East China Sea, they have differences. And in the society, in the people-to-people contact, and in how to deal with international issues, they all have differences. Yet, I would like to emphasize that these two countries, in major international and regional issues, in the bilateral relations, they have a very important convergence of national interests. They both want the peace, stability, continuity of development in the world.
A senior expert of U.S. studies and a very observant watcher on the bilateral relationship, are you aware clearly of the consistency in the official statement from Washington, D.C. concerning China? They would always say, we welcome a stable and prosperous China on condition that you follow up the rules. Now, do you think the United States is ready to share the center stage with China based on the precondition or the platform that we follow the rules that were actually prescribed by the United States and other industrial nations since the end of the Second World War?
Well, that's a big question. I think when China moves on, just now you mentioned, closer to the center stage of politics and economics in the world, and China now comes to dinner, but we are not come here for free. China also makes her own contribution. For instance, in the world's infrastructure, China also makes contribution. China has proposed like the Belt and Road Initiative, for instance. And in U.S.-China relations, for Chinese perspective, we would like to avoid a confrontation with the United States. President Xi Jinping says very well, we like to avoid Thucydides' trap. We don't want to fall into that. We regard the United States always as our biggest partner.
Yeah, China seeks to forge a new type of major power relationship. In that area, I'm afraid the United States is not ready yet to accept China as an equal partner. All right, so much for this part of the discussion here in the Beijing studio. Jessica, I hope our discussion in Beijing has at least partly answered the question you've raised in the beginning. And any more questions you want to ask Dr. Shu Ge here?
Well, absolutely, because you're talking about how China is really increasingly taking the center stage, and that's going to become something to watch more closely during this presidency of Donald Trump, because we've seen on the campaign and even during the early months of his presidency, he's getting out of multilateral deals. He's gotten out of the Paris Climate Accords, as you well know. He's threatening to get out of the Iran nuclear deal, both of which China was extremely instrumental in reaching those two deals. So I think a lot of Americans are wondering, is China ready to lead if the U.S. chooses not to?
For U.S. and China in the world, and we have lots to cooperate, areas to cooperate with each other. Just now you mentioned that there are areas in which United States and China, when we have differences with each other. That is, for instance, you mentioned the Paris Accord. Now the United States is considering withdrawal from that. But I think China is going to stick with it because we feel that to participate, to keep on the general spirit, with the general spirit of the Paris Accord, would serve China's interests, serves the interests of the United States, and serve the interests of everyone in the world. And for China-U.S. relations, we have lots of areas in which we can have we have a convergence of national interests. Even just now you mentioned the Korean Peninsula issue. I think that for this problem, China-U.S. have a very important area in which we have agreement. For instance, both of us want peace and stability in the region. Both of us want denuclearization in the region. And our differences lie where? That is, our differences lie in areas concerning how we can reach that end. China says that the peaceful means only. That's the only correct way, peaceful negotiations. But we feel that U.S. side says that all options are on the table, meaning including military means. We would tell our friends that when you think about the military means, do not shut all doors for if we have sanctions, we shut all doors, at least we should leave one window open that showing North Korea that peaceful negotiations are the only correct way out.
I guess, you know, I've covered the Obama administration closely now. I'm the White House correspondent covering the Trump administration, and I've seen such a difference in approach between these two U.S. presidents on the relationship with China. Of course, it evolves from the beginning of a presidency, and we certainly don't know yet exactly what the China policy is going to look like from this White House, but it does appear that there are fewer opportunities for cooperation because the Trump administration has taken a tougher position on trade. It's taken a cooperation on climate off the table, and you could argue cooperation on Iran off the table. And so I wonder, how does Beijing approach the U.S.-China relationship? What kind of framework does it see in approaching this administration, and what are the tools in its toolbox? Because we used to see this sort of manage conflict through cooperation. There's less opportunity for cooperation that the Trump administration is offering at this point.
So when we look at any coming up of a new administration in the United States, there is a period in which both sides need to feel about each other's way of management of conduct with so far as the foreign relations of each other is concerned. I think that we still need to wait and see, and I don't think that during the new administration of Trump that we will have more difficulties than before. Of course, at the beginning, we have problems. For instance, now the U.S. side is considering the 301 investigation, and it's possible that we may have frictions in the trade and economic area. But both countries, each is the other's biggest trade partner, and I think that in the days to come, and if we have an attitude of cooperation, if we have ways to manage our differences, to avoid confrontation, we try to respect each other's major and core interests, and then we try to have a cooperative attitude and try to find ways so that it's possible that we may have a win-win end in our bilateral relations. And in international relations, I think in the world there are so many things waiting in the international community to have an answer. And U.S.-China is two major countries. If they stand together, it's not possible for both of them to solve all world's major problems. However, if any major world problems in the world, if the United States and China do not cooperate, it will be very hard to find a solution.
Well, thank you so much for your insights, and Yang Rui, thank you so much for including me in this episode of Dialogue.
Thank you, Jessica and Dr. Suge, for briefing us on your insightful comments and questions. In fact, China stands for a fair and renewed world order that aims to be more inclusive, and China also supports a free and fair trade. But it takes time for policymakers like Stephen Bannon, former strategic advisor to President Trump, to accept a prospective economic superpower. The trajectory of China's peaceful development over the past 4 decades shows clearly that the process of engagement and integration should be two-way and mutually beneficial for Beijing and Washington. Director of The Apprentice knows very well what it means. After all, this is business, Mr. Trump. Please stay tuned for our next episode of Across the Line, Questions for the 19th National Congress of the CPC Special Series. Hello and welcome to Cross the Line. Questions for the 19th National Congress of the CPC, the most important political event in the year 2017. I'm Yang Rui in Beijing. For our viewers, both at home and abroad, the upcoming CPC Congress is no doubt an event of a myth that invokes a lot of curiosity. To appease that curiosity, I'll be joined by our outstanding overseas correspondents to co-host the show. They'll bring us questions and perceptions of the event from a completely foreign perspective. To answer these questions and interpret these perceptions, we are joined in our Beijing studio today by Dr. Wang Dong from Peking University. And in New Delhi, our co-host Ravinda Bawa cannot wait to tell us what questions she is going to ask for this edition of the Cross the Line.
Thank you, Yang Rui. It's a pleasure to co-host Cross the Line with you. The major question that I would like to ask for the upcoming 19th Congress of the CPC is that, can India and China learn from each other's development model? So I spoke to a few experts in New Delhi asking them about these issues. Let's hear what they have to say about this issue. The road to friendship between India and China may be long, but still reachable. The two nations have been resolving issues amicably, and the experts believe that they are entering a new phase in their relationship under the present leadership.
There's a lot of complementarity between India and China. And just because the systems are different, just because the models are different, it doesn't mean that the two countries should not work closely together. So it's very, very important to understand, although the countries are very different from each other, there's a lot of areas in which they can both cooperate very productively with each other.
There is a composite development model which Indian have been, implementing. For example, you take Panchayati Raj. We don't see such similar cases in China. Panchayati Raj, where there is a political delegation of power, economic delegation of power, that really doesn't happens in China. There is a lot of disjoint in Chinese political system, and the way economic federalism or economic federal interaction takes place.
Sure.
I think that is a major concept, there's a major lesson the Chinese can learn from India, because there is a lot of interaction, two-way communication happening in Indian federal system, whether that is a political structure or economic structure.
In the case of China, there's extensive public participation takes place, inputs are called for, ideas are called for before a plan gets finalized. In India, typically 3 or 4 officials or 2 or 3 experts whom the officials know meet together and work out a proposal. We need to learn much more from China about how to get a broad-based involvement in the framing of policy in India.
The Chinese are good in application. They just don't talk about theories or big policies, but they also talk about how they would bridge the gap between conceptualizing and application of it. So I think the Chinese are good in application. The moment they find that, okay, there is a model called SCZ or free trade zones, FTZ, SCZ, they would not wait long.
I think it's very important that we learn to know each other better, because the amount of knowledge we have about China and India or India and China is very low. Both the Chinese and the Indians do extensive research on the United States and Europe. Even smaller European countries are given more importance in both India and China than each other. So what's important is more knowledge about each other. These are the 2 largest countries in the world. These are the 2 giants of Asia. And it's very important they learn to see each other through their own lenses and through the lenses of their own needs, rather than borrow lenses from outside that may have an interest in ensuring that we remain perpetually divided from each other.
These are the questions, perceptions from our overseas correspondent who co-hosts this show. Dr. Wang, what do you think of the issue that my counterpart Ravinda addressed through 2 interviews in New Delhi? Are there anything, or is there anything that we can share with India about co-prosperity, pursuing dividends of Belt and Road Initiative, but India has been pretty reluctant in talking about the Belt and Road Initiative.
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, I think in terms of question, what China and India can learn each other from their development model. I think China, one of the success, the sort of secret to China's success story in the past few decades really is the build-up of massive build-up of infrastructure, which laid the foundation ground for robust economic growth, and also it coupled with very important, very I would say wide, wide economic and political institutional reforms, including tax reform and many other in many other economic areas. And this is, I think, what presumably India, the current government, Modi administration, is also trying to learn from China.
Many people at the same time call Prime Minister Modi the Indian equivalent of Deng Xiaoping. Mm-hmm. He was able to navigate the India course independently. Mm-hmm. It remains the leader of the non-aligned movement. Mm-hmm. It undertook bold measures to reform the currency as well as the taxation system. Mm-hmm. Now, he deserves credit for the rapid economic growth of India. But what do you think are the challenges lying ahead for India?
Well, I think no doubt about it. I think India still, despite I think the Indian leadership, I think has tried very hard and put a lot of reforms in line. Still, I think there are a lot of challenges facing up India. For instance, even in terms of the land reform, I think the Modi government was trying to revise the 2013 Land Acquisition Act, which was passed by the Congress government. However, they actually failed to deliver that, and in that generated, I think, quite some disappointment in the international community as to the political will or the capability of Modi government to really put that reform in place. But I think if we actually take a visit to India, I think one thing we can really witness on ground, which is the enthusiasm, the kind of enthusiasm, the kind of very dynamic the outlook toward the reforms, economic growth. So this is something I think China actually experienced a decade ago when our economic reform and opening up sort of started. So in that regard, I think I very much agree with you. I think India does hold a great potential for the next, the engine of growth in Asia. So together, I think there's a huge potential for China and India work together economically speaking.
One frosty issue of mistrust or trust deficit is quickly emerging between the two biggest economies within the framework of G20. And are you optimistic or cautiously pessimistic? Or the other? I mean, are you cautiously optimistic about the improvement? What can politicians on both sides do to minimize the negative impact of mistrust?
Well, I think there's no doubt about that. One of the biggest challenges facing China-India relations, bilateral relations, is the trust deficits between us. Surprise, I think if you look at the facts, the numbers, it's quite, I actually was struck by the fact that between New Delhi and Beijing, there is not even now daily direct flight. There's every other day, only every other day there's a direct flight. And in terms of the students, young students who are studying in each other countries, currently last year there are only 2,000 Chinese students studying in India, which only accounts for like 1/6 of Indian students studying in China. Even we add the two numbers together, that is not a very significant number compared to the huge populations and the kind of importance, the potential of those two Asian giants. So I think there's a lot of, I personally agree that, believe that both countries, we need to invest great efforts and resources deepen our social, economic, and people-to-people exchange, because this will lay the foundation, very solid foundation for a healthy, stable, and robust bilateral relations between China and India in the years and decades to come.
So let me hand back the floor to my my partner Ravinda to continue with her interviews and her part to push the discussion about the most important bilateral relations, as well as the 19Da, the 19th National Congress of CPC Central Committee, which is the most important political event in the year 2017. Back to you, Ravinda.
Thank you, Yangri. I would actually like to ask Professor Wong that are there any areas where these two countries can actually work together to take the region forward? What are those areas where they can work together, sir?
Well, I think as long as we take a very cooperative and pragmatic attitude toward our bilateral relations and sort of go beyond some of the differences between us and see the broader picture, I think it will immediately becomes very clear there are a lot of things China and India can work together, can cooperate together. For instance, I think Afghanistan, the reconciliation, peace-building process in Afghanistan is definitely one area that China and India can, and in other partners, stakeholders of the international community can work together. And even if we move our eyes to some other areas in Africa, elsewhere, there are actually currently, I think, a lot of business initiative cooperations going on. It just has not yet got attention of the media. So it's very important for us also to put our bilateral relations into perspective. Yes, there are some differences, but they are larger, even much more, I think, share common interests between our two countries. I think this should be the kind of attitude we take when we look at or discuss about our cooperation.
So, Professor Wong, you were talking about trust deficit and the reasons for the same. But do you think these two nations can actually bridge the gap, and if so, how? How can this gap be bridged?
Oh, I think most fundamentally, I think we have to invest a lot of more resources and efforts into building the basics, the basic, quote-unquote, basic infrastructures, the social, economic, and people-to-people ties between our two countries. I think this is something I believe will be most important. And of course, China and India, our two countries, would also work very hard to try to further deepen the economic and trade ties between our two countries, and along the way to address some of the concerns each party might have, including, for instance, the trade imbalance between our two countries. But those issues can definitely be worked out as long as we take a very cooperative attitude toward that.
Well, thank you very much, Ravinda and Dr. Wang, for briefing us on your analysis concerning 19Da, the National Congress of the CPC, as well as bilateral relationship. In fact, there are a lot of things that can be done by both India and China in the area of Shanghai Cooperation Organization, pushing back Islamic extremism, terrorism, and separatism, as well as how to reform the flawed world economic order, such as Bretton Woods, starting from the 1940s, in the wake of the Second World War. These two biggest developing countries have a lot to do in partnership, I believe. Again, we thank you so much for your participation in this special program, which is called Cross the Line. More questions are yet to come in our Cross the Line, questions for the 19th Congress of the CPC special series. Want to know more what the next question is and who will raise it from where? Please stay tuned for our next episode of Cross the Line questions on the 19th Congress of the CPC special series. I'm Yang Rui in Beijing. Goodbye.